Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I am Dr. Bushra Yasmin, the moderator of webinars in economics. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Department of Economics, Fatma Jinnah Women University. I am heartened by enthusiastic response from all of our respondents. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you will attend all of our webinars and will find them useful. This is the first of the series of webinars on COVID-19 and its impact on the economy of Pakistan, organized by the department. Hopefully, this will set stage for more fruitful virtual interactions in the future. We are highly obliged that Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director, SDPI, gave his kind consent to be our first guest speaker. Dr. Sahab's expertise in the economy and economic policy in Pakistan is well known and widely respected. We know the situation of COVID-19 in Pakistan, and also we are aware that government of Pakistan has recently announced the budget in such circumstances, where the sustainable development goals have always remained a target to achieve. So with that reference, today Dr. Vaqar will speak on this very relevant topic on COVID-19, budget fiscal year 2021, and sustainable development goals. And I am looking forward to his valuable insights. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Vaqar. He is with us. Sir, please, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Sava. It's always a pleasure to come back to Fatma Jinnah Women University. It's always an honor, and thank you for inviting me. Now, just let me know if my presentation, can you see my presentation now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. So let me start by sort of
yes, sir.
overview that I'll probably be touching on 3 or 4 areas. First, of course, for the interest of students, one would like to inform them about the progress which we have made towards the SDGs. The second, of course, Pakistan's progress and how this could be affected by COVID-19. Third, I would like to touch upon the implementation strategy of Sustainable Development Goals and the very fact that this year's budget gives you an opportunity to think about greater efficiency in your spending, how are you going to mobilize the resources for SDG going forward, given that a large part of your spending is being devoted to COVID-19 related expenditure. So what does that mean for SDGs? Does that mean reduced money? Does that mean improved outlook of foreign assistance, etc.? If one looks at the background, for those of you who may not remember, it was the Sustainable Development Summit in 2015, wherein the UN member countries had adopted these 17 SDGs. And many of you must have seen this infograph, which informs us about the length and breadth of these 17 SDGs, ranging from poverty reduction, working around food insecurity, health, education, gender equality, water sector improvements, energy, etc. So broadly, these are 17 in nature, and these sort of succeed the MDGs, which were fewer, maybe less comprehensive, did not look into the development as a whole. So if you look at the concept of sustainable development and why is it sort of regarded, why is the concept of sustainable development regarded intellectually superior? That's because of one reason, because sustainable development framework talks about 3 main pillars. The first one is economic growth, the second one is social justice, and the third one is respect for environment and natural resources. So it's a much more holistic and comprehensive framework which SDGs provide you. Now, Pakistan's progress until now, and this is pre-COVID I'm talking about, after endorsing these SDGs, we had unanimously approved SDGs as the National Development Agenda. We also formed Parliament's SDGs Secretariat. So all the federal as well as the provincial parliaments have a working group in the National Assembly as well as the provincial assemblies who monitor their local level SDGs progress. We also understand that at the start of SDGs, the countries also had to come up with the national baseline and where do you want to be in 2030. So, for example, if you read the first line, for the first goal, we had said that we want to reduce the proportion of population living below the poverty line from almost 30% in 2014 to 9% in 2030. So for each of the indicators for which the data was available in Pakistan, we have committed to a certain level of target which we want to achieve in 2030. The process of implementing these SDGs is sixfold. First is that you have to align the SDGs with your own national policy. So SDGs is not an agenda which is being dictated to any country. You have to incorporate SDGs, customize SDGs as part of your own annual plan, 5-year plan. Or the way we had done back then, we had aligned it in 2015 with Pakistan's national development document. At that point, it was called the Vision 2025 document. From alignment, we moved to institutional mechanism. And as I said, we have an institutional mechanism, which I'll show you in a while, but it starts from the parliament and right at the district level, civil service, which is responsible to localize the SDGs. And then, of course, if you plan for SDGs, you need to budget for them as well. So one needs to prioritize SDGs going forward. You may not have a budget for each and every SDG every year. So some SDGs may have to come first, some may have to come later. And this is what we did in the fourth step. After the prioritization exercise, we budgeted to accelerate the prioritized SDGs. Fifth is to monitor annually your progress towards SDGs, and Pakistan Bureau of Statistics and provincial bureaus of statistics produce this data based on which we monitor our progress towards SDGs. And then lastly, there are many things which need to be done by communities and people on their own. So a lot of partnerships are required, collaborations are required between, let's say, the private sector and the public sector, the NGOs and the government to advocate for SDGs at the grassroots level. Now, I just want to touch upon a bit on implementation in the context of 18th Amendment. This constitutional amendment added a new element to our development implementation, where we devolved several of the public functions, including the social services. However, each of the province is now autonomous to follow their own development goals. So they can localize, they can prioritize SDG in their own way, which they feel important for their needs, for their requirements. So unlike prior to 2010, where the federal government used to come up with a 10-year perspective plan for the entire country or a 5-year development plan for the whole federation, it is the provinces who now come up with their own plans, which is very good that they have a room to think about their own development strategies and then align them with SDGs. So you have good development frameworks like a Sindh growth strategy, Punjab growth strategy, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Comprehensive Development Plan. You have a Balochistan Sustainable Development Strategy. So every province, you have a similar document for GB and AJK as well. Every province is now autonomous to sort of take forward their own development goals. At the federal level, it was the Ministry of Planning and Development which has sort of taken a lead. And as you would know, a national initiative for SDGs to institutionalize 2030 agenda was basically initiated with the consultation, with the endorsement of all the provinces. And this initiative sort of brings together planning, budgeting, and statistical institutions to work collaboratively and lay the foundations of SDGs. So if I have to put the entire implementation framework of SDGs in one chart, we start from right here, where you have a federal level support unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development. You have provincial SDG support units at provincial capitals, housed in the Planning and Development Department of each capital. Then once each of the provinces have prioritized their SDGs, for each of the priority SDG, you have thematic coordination committees. And these, of course, provide their input to National Coordination Committee, which is also interministerial. So one of the things to remember about SDGs is that they are cross-cutting. So a single ministry or a single department may not be able to achieve one of the SDGs. They would require an interministerial effort to make this happen. Then you have provincial coordination committee, and then the Parliament's task force, which finally looks into SDG progress and reports it back to the relevant high-level forum at the United Nations. The federal SDG unit, which is housed in the Planning Commission, it mainstreams SDGs in local plans, clearly outlining the resource environment. How much money would we require to achieve these SDGs? So this is the task of this unit. Then they also are involved in data reporting. They are strengthening, coordinating, reporting, and monitoring the mechanisms for SDGs. At a third step, they are involved in looking into the financial flows and the fact that they need to be aligned with the 2030 agenda. And finally, the innovation that has to be brought in. The traditional ways of development implementation are short-lived, they have their shortcomings. So this unit is engaging with the stakeholders to continuously find out new ways and innovate approaches to accelerate progress on SDGs. Now, as I said, every province has tried to prioritize their SDGs, and then, of course, based upon provincial inputs, federal government also prioritized the national level SDGs. So currently, in case of Pakistan, priority 1 is being given to these SDGs, which is food security, health, education, water, energy, economic growth and job creation, and peace and justice, rule of law, and strong institutions. Likewise, if we move to priority 2, we see a reduction of poverty, gender equality, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, urban development, and global partnerships as the second priority, which the government of Pakistan has put for itself, taking advice from the provincial governments and the consultative process with the communities. Priority 3 is being given to responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and life below land. So one of the things that would be interesting to see and discuss is how COVID-19 would change, or if it would change, if it should change, the priority which the government has put in place for the achievement of SDGs. Now, one of the most important documents which we produce annually, the Planning Commission produces annually, it's called the Voluntary National Reviews. Every country now produces it to review progress on SDG indicators. In Pakistan, a National Advisory Committee on SDGs reviews VNR. This VNR provides you with details on what sort of legislation is required to implement the SDGs if some of the provinces say that they are unable to move forward with any specific SDG simply because of a missing legislation. So that is something which you have to do during the year with the parliament to make to bring new legislation, to speed up the implementation of SDGs, to make amendment to existing legislation. Second, you also have to continuously map SDGs with national plans and policies. So you can see over here that the goal around reducing poverty is mapped with national technical education and vocational training policy, creation of poverty alleviation and social safety ministry, which we have done now. Likewise, the health goal is related with National Health Vision 2025. So VNR report tells you every year that which goal is aligned with which of the sectoral policies. And then third, VNR also explains whether we are making any progress to improve our data requirement to monitor the SDGs. Currently, Pakistan hasn't got data on all the SDG indicators. So data remains an issue. One would like to improve the survey tools, the questionnaires of our statistical agencies, so that we can have data sets for most of the institutions that are involved in the implementation of SDGs. We also aim to see that what are those planning tools which are required to implement SDGs. So for example, if you look at the first slide, one of the things that 2019 VNR points out is the need to expand freelancing industry to address the job creation problem. And this makes sense because around 60% of your GDP is the services sector. And you have a growing freelance sector, which if promoted can really, the size of the industry can be raised from almost $1 billion at the moment to $5 billion by 2030 if you encourage this industry. Likewise, we see for other goals as well, you have this flexibility in the VNR as well as your local plans to incorporate goal-wise new planning frameworks. And then finally, Planning Commission also has an annual plan through which it can impact SDGs. So if you're serious about addressing climate change, helping improve your environment, you would need to have a strategy which goes into this year's annual plan. So we see upscaling of Green Pakistan program, which has been prominently mentioned in the annual plan of 2019-20. Likewise, ensuring universal health coverage, which has become a priority post-COVID. And then, of course, on the screen, you see other policies which have been made part of this year's annual plan. Last year's annual plan, sorry. So each of the provinces also produce their own annual plans, and they also have the flexibility to monitor the SDGs progress and then see which of the policies needs to be introduced this year to expedite the movement towards SDGs. So you see in this slide, for example, that Balochistan Comprehensive Development and Growth Strategy aims to leverage opportunities emanating from SDGs with a particular focus on China-Pakistan economic corridor and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa's policy focus is on governance, justice, transparency, empowering women. Sindh climate change policy and early childhood care and education policy were aligned with SDGs. In Punjab, all of the new projects or new PC1s that are submitted to the government have to be aligned and validated with the SDG framework. So each of the provinces have also come forward with their own alignment exercises. In terms of our current progress, the VNR report informs us how Pakistan is, of course, moving towards, let's say, improvements in Goal 1, where you see that the proportion of population living below the national poverty line was around 30% in 2014. It reduced to 24.3%. The new data, of course, based on the new data, there is a revision taking place now, but we understand that this goal is now under pressure from COVID-19. So independent estimates suggest that the poverty may have increased up to 39% due to COVID-19. Likewise, in case of zero hunger, VNR reports on prevalence of stunting and prevalence of malnutrition among children. And we have made some progress over here. And we do see that between 2013 and 2018, both these indicators to some extent have shown some improvement. Again, now more recent studies required to see if COVID will impact in the medium to longer term both of these indicators. In case of health, we are reporting on around 6 or 7 indicators for which the data was available until 2016. Of course, there is new data coming in this year, so computations are also taking place based on the last year. But generally speaking, of course, in case of most of the health indicators, there was some progress made between 2014 and 2016. On gender equality, we can track on one of the indicators, which is the proportion of women in managerial position, which improved from 2.7 to 4.8%. For economic growth and job creation, our progress has been slower than anticipated. And you can see that Pakistan's annual growth rate of GDP or economic growth remains well below the presumed potential. And anything below 3% also means that you would have instances of underemployment and unemployment, as you see in the last row as well, that our unemployment rate remains stubborn. No significant improvement between these years. Now, these are some of the readings that one can look into, and most of these reports are available at the Planning Commission's SDGs page. I would particularly encourage you to look for these 3 reports, which is classifying SDGs targets and indicators, Pakistan data reporting gap, and the VNR report, Voluntary National Review report. Let me now turn to the financing of SDGs. Where will the money come from? And we do understand that we need a lot of money to make this happen. We will need local resource mobilization, which could include government's revenue through tax sources, through non-tax sources. We will need the private sector to come forward, which could include the local private sector, the external private sector, such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bloomberg Foundation, etc. We also need a blend of both, which is called the blended finance. So public, private sector, financing clubs coming together to help developing countries achieve SDGs. And then, of course, we will need some support from the development partners as well, which would be multilateral bodies like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and bilateral donors like China, Japan, etc. So we'll need to harness, we'll have to look into each and every source of SDG to really make this happen going forward. And this is where I want to connect with the second part of my presentation, which is this year's budget. Given that this year's budget is so constrained and it's so constrained with the needs to respond to COVID-19 that we are left with very little fiscal space going forward to give to each of the to give priority to each of the SDGs. But the bigger question is, how much money do we need? So one of the reports, which is SDG Investment Map report, this informs that Pakistan will need at least $234 billion by 2030 to deliver on three main SDGs, which this report is interested in, which is the energy sector, digital access, transport, and clean water and sanitation. So I'm very certain that if you look at other SDGs, this investment requirement is bound to grow. But this report sort of presents this investment gap of $234 billion over until 2030 as an investment opportunity for the private sector to come forward and invest in SDGs. And precisely because government's own capacity to fund SDGs is limited. And if you entered into a discussion around budget this year, I would like to start with the current picture of Pakistan's macroeconomic framework. So this is the first time in almost 6 decades that your economic growth has turned negative post-COVID. And the recovery in next year is also going to be very slow. And if the timeline of COVID is prolonged, and let's suppose that the selective lockdowns faced in main urban areas go well into the first quarter or the second quarter of this year, for example, then of course even achieving this 2% growth in fiscal year 2021 may be difficult. The investment to GDP ratio also remains weak and may be falling next year. And there's limited public investment capacity, which could have kick-started growth. Inflation is of course low given the lack of demand in the economy. But fiscal deficit may be higher than estimated, while the government is estimating a 7% budget deficit. This is percentage of GDP. Most of the independent economists are saying that this may touch somewhere around 9.5 or 10%, given the government's need to finance COVID-related expenses. And our current account may also remain under pressure if external assistance doesn't materialize on time. So the medium-term trends that we are looking at is that the pandemic is expected to bring about sharp economic contraction, and recovery could be slower than expected. And to finance the running and expected expenditures, the government will be relying on support from multilateral bodies and bilateral assistance. As I said, there are risks to the current account and the balance of payments. Some of these risks have reduced off external assistance, including the rapid finance instrument facility provided by the IMF. However, there are limits to how much of this assistance can come from abroad. We're already looking at literature which says there are limits to the traditional aid and ODA. So for example, if advanced countries also see a prolonged incidence of COVID, they may be requiring their money abroad in their own countries instead of giving it to the poor countries. And yesterday we have seen that the UK Prime Minister has almost rationalized the role of their international aid arm. But I think the bottom line is that our own priorities will increase in the medium term, and supporting communities in distress will remain a priority through the EHSAS program or supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises, and of course through packages of job creation such as the construction sector package. We are also passing through an IMF program, which also means that the extended fund facility given to us by IMF requires us to follow a very tight structural reforms agenda. We need to show improvements in energy sector. We need to cut down the losses of the public sector enterprises. We need to ensure progress on improving tax administration and public expenditure management. At the same time, I believe that commitment to this IMF program is important. It's important that Pakistan shows strong resolve to meeting IMF's demands, because these ultimately help you to raise funds from other partners as well, other donors and development partners as well. This is how the budget for fiscal year 21 looks like. We have a 7 trillion rupees of outlay. We understand that we are sort of overstretched. So if you start from here, this is the overall tax revenue position. These are the non-tax revenues. So government's gross income is around 6.5 trillion rupees. Out of this, due to the NFC National Finance Award, 2.8 trillion would go to the provinces, and the federal government will be left with only 3.7 trillion rupees, right? So out of this 3.7 trillion rupees, federal government needs to make these expenditures, and you have 3.7 trillion. But out of this 3.7 trillion, almost 3 trillion is gone in interest payments. You have to pay your debt. So you are left with 700 billion only. Out of 700 billion, you pay for your pensions, and you're left with less than half of the amount. So your entire defense expenditure, your grants to provinces, your subsidies, your running of civil government in Islamabad, your contingencies, they are all being paid by debt now, right? You don't have money to run your own civil administration, to run your defense, to run grants and transfers to smaller provinces. You pay for these needs through borrowing. This is where the borrowing is coming from, right? You will have to borrow from the banking sector almost 889 billion rupees. You would be launching treasury bills, Pak investment bonds, Sukuk. You are expecting very little amount from privatization. And then there will be non-bank borrowing, for which you will also be approaching commercial banks abroad. And there'll be net external receipts. You're requesting some amount from the donors. Now, this year, if you look at the expenditure side, interest payment has increased, pensions increased, defense has also seen an increase this year, and running of civil government has seen an increase. The thing which has seen a reduction was development budget. So you run the government, you run a big government, of small and medium enterprises. At the same time, we are feeling that high bank borrowing by the government could be a source of crowding out, and banks may be discouraged to lend to SMEs because they'll have the opportunity to lend to the government in a risk-free mode. The lesser development spending or public sector development program, PSDP, could slow down economic recovery. And I also see three risks or slippages in this year's budget. The first one is that the federal budget is relying to some extent on provinces giving surpluses in their budgets. I see this as unrealistic because provincial budgets are already overstretched due to COVID. And expecting the provinces to give surplus to the federal government seems unrealistic in today's times. Second, I also don't see that federal government will be able to reduce their federal subsidies as they have projected in this year's budget. I, in fact, see that the subsidies would need to be increased to mitigate the pain. And then thirdly, the tax revenue target seems ambitious. I fear that FBR may not be able to collect this high taxes. And I can show you that FBR is being asked to collect around 5 trillion rupees of tax for next year. And they could barely make it to 4 billion this year. So they have missed their targets by miles this year, given the impact of COVID. So it's going to be challenging to collect 4.9 trillion. The government has given major reductions in customs duties and sales tax, which means that the government will have to compensate the revenue loss through non-tax revenues, like increasing the petroleum development levy, utilizing the profits of State Bank of Pakistan, and markups of public sector enterprises. The key distortions that need to be addressed in the budget, we believe that federal provincial tax policy coordination needs to be improved. There is weak effort to bring down compliance costs. And if we can bring large people who are large tax avoiders or evaders, I think that can relieve some pressure on FBR this year. On the expenditure side, we see markup payments, interest payments, debt servicing will remain high during the medium term. We may even need to take more debt going forward. But in view of the power sector inquiry, sugar sector inquiry, wheat sector inquiry, we believe that there is a need to carefully assess the rationale and effectiveness of grants, transfers, and other subsidy programs. There is a case to make them more targeted. There's a case to do away with hidden and cross subsidies. And then you can create more room for development expenditure. In terms of the development budget, the total national development budget is 1.3 trillion rupees for this year, out of which the federal government has 650 billion with itself. And out of the 650 billion, the major expenditures that we see, the major beneficiaries are transport sector, water sector, energy sector. The development spending is thinly spread, which means that it is unable to provide for, let's say, productivity growth in agriculture and industry. There are weak allocations seen in the case of social sector and human development programs, which the federal government feels is the responsibility of the provinces. But our case was that this is a COVID year and some responsibility should also fall on the federal government to help the provinces in meeting their COVID-related requirements. There is some development expenditure outside of PSDP. So, for example, PTI government is ambitious on their low-cost housing scheme, which has been parked outside PSDP, and some allocation for Naya Pakistan Housing Authority has been provided. There's allocation for crop and life insurance schemes, Kamyab Jawan program for giving jobs to the youth, agriculture and SME lending program. There are allocations for this. But what we are not clear about is that the budget documents seem to be silent on where would these expenditures be provided from. In most cases, indicative expenses have been shown. There aren't any estimations based on the need for these expenses. And one would recommend prudence over here, given that such expenses can widen the fiscal deficit, and an increase in cost is expected if the value of Pakistani rupee falls in fiscal year 21. The economic growth prospects for the next year, and of course, these prospects are important for revenue authorities as well. The reduction in customs duty of essential raw materials could help promote essential industries. There are opportunities on COVID. There are opportunities in COVID for enterprises working in online, digital space, e-commerce sector, and there are opportunities for manufacturing enterprises as well to repurpose and supply for COVID-related equipment, medical equipment, personal protective equipment. Pharmaceutical companies are repurposing to scale up their production of COVID-related medication, health and hygiene equipment, etc. And the budgetary provisions that we have, for example, seem to be positive for health sector, personal protective equipment, pharmaceutical, iron and steel. All of these sectors have been given some incentive in a budget for fiscal year 21. We've also seen that to stimulate investment, the concessions available for special economic zones have been enhanced. And as I said, that the proposed growth promoting sectors in the budget include low-cost housing and construction, and the 40 allied industries of construction. My final slide talks about 6 main areas where we now need to make some progress so that we can not only deal with constraints in the budget, lower development expenditure available in this COVID year, and of course to achieve our SDGs or continue to move towards our SDGs achievement. First is the need to improve the donor coordination framework in Pakistan. So currently, what the donor bodies will inform you is that federal government submits some request. The same request could come from the Balochistan government or the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government. So there's no central mechanism of how to contact donors so that they can finance SDGs or COVID-related needs this year. So our recommendation is that the Economic Affairs Division would be best placed to put in place a donor coordination architecture so that we can approach the donors for our pandemic-related needs in a very systematic manner. If you Google or look at the NDMA's website, National Disaster Management Authority website, there is a costing given for our pandemic-related needs. And for the first round of pandemic, Pakistan needs foreign assistance of somewhere around $4 billion. And to access this large amount, you really need to be very cogent in your request to the donors. Second, to improve your tax collection at a time when your economic growth is slowing down, you will need some tax administration reforms. You will need reforms to reduce compliance costs of taxpayers. And COVID-19 really looks towards rethinking, reimagining the way our tax authorities work today. Likewise, the third recommendation is that because you have lesser development budget, lesser money available to spend on people's welfare, hence the need to use that money with greater care and greater efficiency. So we are proposing that improved systems of monitoring and evaluation may be introduced to help efficiency in public spending. We believe that the size of debt will grow in the next 2 to 3 years, given that we have to finance our COVID-related needs apart from the support needed for other SDGs. And for this, the Ministry of Finance now needs to strengthen its debt management strategy going forward. And that's our fourth recommendation. Fifth, while the President has now issued the notification to start rethinking on the National Finance Award and the way federations' resources are split between federal government and the provinces, we believe that smaller provinces are keener to rethink the current NFC arrangement in their favor, and they probably need to be helped in this pursuit. Finally, Pakistan would need to maintain the course and the reforms promised with IMF under the Extended Fund Program, EFF facility. And we believe that Pakistan must fulfill its promise to reform its power and gas sector, cut down losses of public sector enterprises, improve working of the federal and provincial civil administrations at the secretariat as well as at the district level, and adhere to all the reforms which have been promised under EFF. This will not only restore confidence in Pakistan's reform achievement capability, it will show the donors that yes, we are serious in achieving our own development goals. With this, I can end my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, or if there are any points for clarification from your side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an informative and thought-provoking talk. What we have seen, the picture of the economy, which is expected as per the given circumstances, is not that much promising, and the budget is as well not that much promising for the reasons of COVID-19. And in the wake of COVID-19, the targets of sustainable development goals, I think now are to be taken up with more cautious move with the support of fiscal decentralization. However, what we have learned that from today's lecture, that federal government responsibility in this COVID year is much bigger as compared with the normal year. From the other lessons of this lecture, other than continuing the existing liberalization program and the facilitation strategies, we need to actually make align and streamline our new investment opportunity with the global shock in the form of COVID-19 that actually will be required for a sustainable future. In particular, as you mentioned, that investment in e-health services, e-business, and e-commerce firm can be potential sectors. Finally, as you concluded that we as well need a debt management strategy, tax management, efficient public spending, and we do need to improve the system of monitoring and evaluation. We all much agree with this. I encourage the students here to go through the reports for more understanding of the ongoing process of the implementation and monitoring by reading BNR, data reporting gap, and other reports mentioned by Dr. Vaqar. Thank you so much, sir, for being here and for delivering such an informative and thought-provoking lecture. And the floor is now open for question answer. As per the guidelines, as we know, in Google Meet there was no raise hand option. So to avoid mishandling of question, we have requested the participants to write their question in chat box. I will now request Dr. Faiza Khan to please ask the question from Dr. Vaqar with the name and organization of the participant. We have reserved 10 minutes for question answer. Hand it over to you, Dr. Faiza.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. Sir, there are quite a few questions from you. If I am audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Dr. Saab. You
Okay.
can hear properly.
Yes, I can hear
Sir,
you
can
now.
you hear me?
Yes, I can
Okay,
hear
Okay,
you
thank
now.
you,
thank
sir.
you.
Sir, the first
Thank you
question
so
is
much.
from Tanzila Rafi. She is the student of Fatma Jinnah Women University in Department of Economics. And her question is, during this uncertain situation of pandemic, our government is facing huge budget deficit in this fiscal year as well as the coming fiscal year. So how government can achieve SDGs with such huge budget deficit and debt burden?
Yes, so I think that's the kind of argument and that's the kind of question that we need to ask ourselves and ask the government, that given the lower resource availability, how can we spend the available resources more efficiently? Number one. Number two, how can we remove any duplicity and multiplicity across our development schemes? So if federation or federal government is bringing some development scheme, which is to help Balochistan government, for example, then Balochistan government's budget should not have that scheme. And currently, this level of coordination is missing. And that's why I'm in favor of having more Council of Common Interest meetings, increasing the frequency of National Economic Council meetings so that greater coordination can be achieved across federal and provincial budgets. Second, this is why I had argued that we need to approach the donors in a more informed manner. We should approach donors with sound feasibilities. Currently, we are expecting to approach donors without any needs assessment of COVID. Even the needs assessment of SDGs was delayed by several years. So we need to sort of have good modeling capacities that revise our SDGs investment requirement every year, and then approach donors in a very informed manner. And then finally, I think what the Standard Charter report informed us was that many of the SDGs, in fact, most of them, present an opportunity for the private sector. So the private sector wants to invest in SDGs, particularly through the public-private partnership mode. So why not clear our markets? Why not make our markets more competitive, have a fair and competitive market regime, so reduce barriers to entry for the private sector, reduce regulatory burden for the private sector, so that they can come in and finance the SDGs.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is from Huboor Sohail. She is a bachelor student in Fatma Jinnah Women University. She asked, does the budget provide specific allocation of resources to each priority area of SDGs? And sir, there is a related question by two people, Shazia Parveen from Masters Economics and Amna Rashid from Bachelor's Economics, that what are our prospects of achieving SDGs by 2030, especially given the pandemic?
So Dr. What was the first one?
Sir, it was that does the budget provide specific allocation of resources to each priority of SDGs?
Yes, sir, certainly. So if you look at the PSDP, Public Sector Development Program document, which is uploaded now on the Planning Commission website, there is allocation, there is disbursement going to each of the SDGs. However, some would receive more, some would receive less, depending upon the urgency in each and every sector. Of course, I think that, and this is my response to the second question, that we are working with governance gaps, we are working with lesser resources, due to which our pursuit towards SDGs could slow down. It is likely that if, for example, you had to achieve a poverty headcount ratio of 9% by 2030, you may be standing at, let's say, 11, 12, 15%. You may not be able to reach 9%, but at least I think our goal should be to reach as near as we can to the targets that we have set for 2030.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is from Ms. Maria Mazhar. She is an MPhil scholar at Quaid-e-Azam University. Her question is, in this uncertain situation of COVID, when poverty has increased, how tax can be used as a tool of financing SDG goals, and which type of tax will be useful?
Yeah, so I think this is where this is an opportunity to bring tax administrative reforms in FBR and the 13 other tax bodies. Many of them are with the provincial government now, so Punjab Revenue Authority, Sindh Revenue Board. I think we need to improve the administration, audit, risk management over there, so that they can now reach those taxpayers who may have liability to pay and are not paying. In the COVID times, when poverty is increasing, there is joblessness, for example, we cannot squeeze the existing taxpayers. We cannot demand the existing taxpayers to pay more. We have to go after those taxpayers who have been evading or who have been avoiding taxes. And this is where I think tapping into the informal economy, not the smaller vendors, but the larger players in the informal economy comes in. And because there are economic students over here, let me tell you that cash holding to GDP ratio is increasing in Pakistan. Globally, because of financial inclusion, because of digital banking, because of online banking, cash holding to GDP ratio is decreasing globally. In Pakistan, it is increasing. So which means that people have large cash holdings. A construction package was announced, and you saw an advertisement in the newspaper that the Construction Sector Association came back and they said that, look, we need tax amnesty, we need more tax break, and we'll be willing to help. What this means is, if anybody is demanding tax amnesty, this means that they are sitting on large cash. So FBR needs to have that capacity of forensic audit, risk-based audit, so that they can reach that amounts of cash, or people who are holding this kind of liquid money which may not be accounted for by the banking sector or by FBR.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is by Marwa Fayaz. She is from Masters Economics from Fatma Jinnah Women University. And she is interested to know, has external debt ever contributed in the economic development of Pakistan? If you look at the history of Pakistan over the past 30-40 years, that we have been taking loans for many years, then why our economic conditions are not improving? And sir, the next question is by Ms. Aman Khan from Bachelor's Economics 6th semester. And her question is, what policy framework suits Pakistan economy in this crisis period, along with rising fiscal stress and debt overhang? Sir, sorry, I can't hear you.
So just taking the first question, that has debt led to improvement or not? I think debt only debt per se is not the only variable that will lead to development. Debt is there, or foreign assistance or grants are there to help you in augmenting your local resources, which may be less. All countries would take debt to finance their spending. The main issue is, how do you utilize that debt? Have you plugged in the leakages in your system? If you are taking debt to, let's say, finance your human development, that's an investment in future. But if you are taking debt to, let's say, plug in the losses of your power sector, electricity sector, gas sector losses of public sector enterprises, you don't want to reform them, you continue to subsidize them, for example. So that means that the debt is going down the drain. And yes, your question is right, it won't then contribute to the longer term economic growth because your bowl is broken and it is leaking, and you are not ready to plug those financial leakages going forward. So what Pakistan has done last year is that we have passed a public finance management law, which sort of binds the government that where can debt be used and where debt cannot be used. So of course, now we are standing in a COVID year, so essentially, yes, there is a rationale to relax some of those conditions, but more generally, I think going forward, the governments would be bound by Pakistan public finance management law, which will hopefully bring greater prudence in the manner we use our foreign assistance. For the second question, that what sort of policy framework we use to go forward. So I had the honor, you were kind to invite me at the university to present my book, Pakistan's Agenda for Economic Reforms, published by the Oxford University Press. And therein, I thought that I'd highlighted one of the key ingredients in your policy framework that are missing. And that's to do with public administration. The fact that the only tool that you have for effective development administration is a civil service. So you really need to see how the civil service, or the ways through which the civil service works and implements development, needs to be innovated. This also calls for greater social accountability, and communities need to hold their political representatives accountable going forward. This also calls for improved monitoring and evaluation in our planning departments, improved monitoring and evaluation of projects approved under PSDP and ADP. And I think the 6 pillars which I had tried to sort of outline in my book are almost very near to what the government reached an agreement with in the IMF's EFF facility. Those are the main areas where hemorrhaging is taking place, and we sort of need to plug them. So connecting this with the first question, countries have taken foreign assistance, but the difference between, let's say, South Korea and Pakistan is the way we utilize debt. South Korea took almost the same or maybe more debt than Pakistan. At times it was running higher debt levels, but they utilized it in sectors where, for example, they could increase their productivity of energy. They invested the same debt into brand development. And today you see the likes of Samsung, LG, and many other brands coming out of South Korea. This is the investment of those high debt periods of 60s, 50s, and 60s, the same periods when you were getting higher debt levels as well.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is by Ms. Sadia Sherbaz, who is our faculty member. And her question is, how does IMF conditionalities align with achievement of SDGs?
How does
IMF conditionalities align with achievement of SDGs? And sir, a related question is by Isma Samreen, who is an MPhil scholar at QAU, that how is it possible for government to maintain its promise with IMF in the current pandemic situation?
Yes, so I think given that in the 90s and 2000s, in the past 2 decades, IMF came under extensive criticism that they only take a macroeconomic view of things, and they are not concerned by the microeconomy or the welfare implications of the program. So now, if you look at the IMF programs, they're very mindful of the social impact. They're mindful of governments getting unpopular due to their agreements with IMF. So if you read the IMF country report for Pakistan this year, there's a lot of human face that they have given to their program. And IMF continues to stress that there should be timely releases of Ehsaas program, other social protection programs, social safety nets. IMF continues to advocate that you should cut down your current spending and increase your development spending, which is a good change from the past. And institution like IMF has learned from the past. And they are absolutely pro SDGs. They want you to create more room in your budget to finance those SDGs. But I think for COVID year, and this is your second question, for COVID year, IMF has been sympathetic. They have uh, deferred, they have firstly provided you with a rapid finance facility of almost $1.38 billion, which is over and above the extended fund facility. Furthermore, they are also willing to give you some deferment in the debt repayment which you had to make to the IMF this year. So there's a 15-month relief which you have got to pay to them. And we believe that in the coming days, if the COVID pain lasts in the first quarter or the second quarter of fiscal year 21, IMF may be willing to give further concession as well.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is by Ikra Zaib of Bachelor's Economics, Fatma Jinnah Women University. And her question is, how a tax revenue target will be achieved in the coming fiscal year given the pandemic? Well, like, what's the feasibility of achieving the target government has set in this budget?
I personally don't think that the government will be able to achieve this target. I did have a chance to interact informally with colleagues at FDR as well, and they also do not seem very confident to achieve this year's target, and maybe rightly so, because you don't know the timeline of this crisis. Pakistan is again going back into lockdown regime. You now have selective lockdowns taking place in major urban areas. So if these lockdowns increase in the first quarter to help bring the infection rate down, you would have economic activity slowing down once again, and FBR cannot expect to charge the same withholding taxes or advanced taxes to enterprises which are sort of shut down or which aren't working. So this is precisely why Dr. Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, when he addressed the press conference immediately after the budget, he said that it is likely that these budget estimates, including the tax estimates, may be revised at the end of the first quarter or the second quarter.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is by Dr. Huma Ayub, who is a faculty in Business Administration Department. And her question is that regarding the cost of crowding out effort of government securities at the cost of lending to SMEs, which may further deepen the current pandemic situation. So what's your views to redirect or channelize the funds of banking sector to the private sector, which in her view is the need of the time?
Yes, I think Dr. Saab has asked a very important question, and this is exactly what I pointed out in my presentation as well, that if government is relying on borrowing almost 1 trillion rupees from the local banks, what would be left for the private sector? And I'm sure that this bank borrowing has been underestimated. If your tax revenue falls short, you would need more bank borrowing. And Dr. Saab is right in pointing out that this will lead to crowding out. Now, you need to be more innovative here. As I said, there is money lying with the private sector. You just need to tap it. And herein, of course, one needs to be innovative. That can you attract the money currently in the informal economy and help it to bring into the formal economy? You will need some innovative instruments. That's one. Second is that your diaspora wants to invest from abroad. Many of them have, in fact, informed that they want to invest in or spend towards Pakistan's COVID-related needs. Many of them want to sort of help the SMEs. What they are asking for is a decent framework around venture capital to help the SMEs. They are asking about decent laws around crowdfunding. I think this is where government needs to look towards. If Pakistani diaspora has to be attracted to help these SMEs going forward. Of course, there could be local financing windows as well that you can think about. You can give longer term tax breaks to people who invest in a revolving fund, in a sort of a Marshall Plan-like fund for SMEs in Pakistan.
And sir, the next question is by Aisha Noor, who is a bachelor economics student, and she wanted to ask about the high inflation, that our revised GDP growth is negative, poverty has increased, and we are also taking debt. So why inflation is still very high, like 11.2%?
Yes, so 11.2% is the annual inflation, but if you look at the monthly figures, it is now tapering, and inflation has come down to single digit in the past month, and we believe that it may fall down even further on the back of reduced demand in the economy, as well as the contraction of global economy. This year, the global economy is expected to contract by almost 5%. So the inflation is coming down.
And sir, Nihal Amdani from Bachelor's Economics wants to ask that what instruments of budgetary, fiscal and monetary policy should additionally be introduced to stimulate economic growth during this pandemic? Or is the working of fiscal and monetary policy fine given the pandemic?
No, I think there is room for improvement. So for example, as I said, there is a case for improving the coordination between fiscal policy at federal and provincial level. There is room for greater coordination between the finance secretaries as well as the planning secretaries across the federation. In terms of the monetary policy, the central bank needs to know that despite of allowing a reduced interest rate for SMEs so that their COVID-related needs can be met, so that SMEs can be saved during COVID times, why aren't the commercial banks lending to the SMEs? The state bank is saying that we've allowed a single digit policy rate, but even at that reduced interest rate, many of the SMEs are not getting the money, and banks are charging high premium. And this is where probably the central bank needs to look into.
And sir, the last question is, given the high tax revenue target and the pandemic, so how it will affect the poverty situation in the country? Because government is increasing the taxes and there is pandemic as well, so it may increase the poverty in the country.
Yes, so government hasn't increased the tax on existing taxpayers in this budget. In fact, there is a major relief which has been given. The general sales tax has been reduced. There are exemptions given for customs duties, additional customs duties. We are hoping that some withholding taxes may also be rationalized. And this reduced tax burden may mitigate some of the pains of the taxpayers.
Thank you very much, sir. That was it from the question and answer session. And now I hand over the mic to Dr. Bushra Yasmin.
Thank you so much, sir, for handling the questions so smoothly, and everyone get some fruitful responses. Thank you so much. So it's the time to say goodbye. Thank you so much, sir, for gracing the event and giving your kind consent. This was actually the inauguration of our webinars in economics as well. We luckily started from yourself. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. We are looking forward to see you next week, next webinar, inshallah. Take care and Allah Hafiz.